Good morning and welcome to The Point. Well, it's been more than a month since the election and we should be moving on, but all of the talk of recounts continues to make this election very current. And if that's not enough, Donald Trump is still on the campaign trail. He returned to one of his favorite venues in West Michigan, the Deltaplex, for a thank you rally. And his very first comments from the stage acknowledged that Michigan's recount is over.
I'm here tonight for one main reason: to say thank you to the incredible people of Michigan. Incredible. You went out and pounded the pavement, organized your fellow citizens, and propelled to victory a grassroots movement, the likes of which actually, the world, we don't just have to say the country, the world has never seen. And now we're going to bring back your jobs. I said, let's go to Michigan. And some of you, I see some faces, some of you were here. And tell me. So we had, between inside and outside, we had 31,000 people. And I started speaking at almost 1 o'clock in the morning. So now it was election day, right? Because now it was Tuesday. I left on Monday. By the time we got here, it was almost 1 o'clock in the morning. We had 31,000 people at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I said, we are going to win Michigan. I felt it. I said, how does somebody else win it? And we did. And by the way, I heard a half an hour ago, the courts ruled we totally won it. It's over.
And the president-elect rolled out his West Michigan pick for Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos.
It's time to make education great again in this country. This means putting kids first every single day. This means expanding choices and options to give every child the opportunity for a quality education regardless of their zip code or their family circumstances. This means letting states set their own high standards and finally putting an end to the federalized Common Core.
In just a few weeks, the inauguration, and then everybody gets down to the business of governance. Same is true in Lansing, where new leadership has been picked. The new Speaker of the House for the coming session will be Representative Tom Leonard. He's from the central part of the state, and the Republican lawmaker told us how he'll approach the job. There was a time, and I don't expect that this was your take, but for observers, there was a time when we wondered what the makeup of the House might look like. Would Republicans maintain a majority? There was a time when it looked like Democrats had a lot of wind in their sails, and we know on November 8th things turned out considerably differently. So you come back with about the same majority in the House of Representatives, you'll be the leader.
Absolutely, and what you saw is, in addition to the Trump factor, you saw that good policy makes good politics. House Republicans have led the last 6 years. You've seen incomes on the rise. You've seen 475,000 private sector jobs created. And what you saw this year in this election cycle, Rick, is that good policy makes good politics, and they returned us with 63 seats for next term.
When you think about Republicans, as you point out, for the past 6 years, controlling most of the levers of government, all of the big ones around Lansing, and you've got that again for 2 more years. At once, you say, well, this is good because now we can make policy. At the same time, you have to say, okay, now we have to make policy. You have no excuses because you are in control. So what become the priorities, understanding that as you and I talk, lame duck has not yet completed and we don't know what's going to happen. We'll get to that in a minute. But what will the priorities be for you and your caucus as you move forward?
So what we will do going forward, we will do just like we have in the past. We will present our House Action Plan. This is something that was put together by Speaker Bolger 6 years ago. And it's our way as a caucus of holding ourselves accountable and being transparent to the citizens of this state. So what we will do is we will appoint about 10, 12 caucus members to get together and formulate our policy for our plan going forward, and that will probably be presented to the public in February. Now, for myself, there are three main priorities I personally would like to see our caucus work on. First is, and as you know, the Senate is currently debating and working on MIPSR's reform, this broken teacher retirement system we have in our state that's costing our state and our local schools 36% of its payroll. That is something we've got to fix, and that's something we've got to address. Mental health, that is a big thing that I would like to see us tackle. Right now, when we sentence somebody to prison, we're spending $40,000 per year per inmate. If that person suffers from a mental illness, those costs go from $40,000 to $120,000. And right now, 25% of our inmates in prison suffer from some type of mental illness. So that's something I'd like to see us address. And then third, skilled trades. We've got thousands of jobs right now that are not currently being filled, good paying jobs. I talked to somebody who had an opening, a job posting for a welder. Required a certification, again, to be a welder, was going to pay nearly $70,000 per year, full health benefits, and they only had 2 people apply for the position. So these are just 3 of the agenda items that I, as the incoming speaker, would like to see us tackle.
Well, let's talk about all 3 of those. Let's first talk about teacher retirement and that retirement system that is, you say, putting a big burden on some of these budgets. As we talk about that looking forward, we know that it's happening in lame duck, but it seems to me, again, as an observer, that would be a heavy lift to get that done in the few days that are remaining. So do you anticipate that being something that carries over, or can it get done in lame duck?
Well, I would like to see it get done in lame duck, and I'm not going to put anything past what we may get accomplished. I mean, we have done some heavy lifting before in lame duck, so we'll see where it goes. But if we don't, certainly something that's not going away and we need to address. I mean, if you remember just a few years ago, and this is what I tried telling my local schools when I listened to them, I recently met with a couple of superintendents to talk to them about this issue. If you remember, the state about 5 years ago capped a local school's liability at 26% of the payroll. So the state is covering the 26 to 36% for them. That is over $1 billion per year. When you look at a district like mine that has all of those small school districts that are on the lowest end of the per pupil foundation allowance, it costs $600 per student just to cover that 10%. That doesn't even cover the first 26%. So what I have told my local teachers, what I've told my local superintendents, if we can get this thing under control, if we can get it back down to 7% of the payroll, where every other state employee is at, we can get more money into the classrooms and even talk about giving our fine teachers raises.
And when you talk about $1 billion, to put that in perspective, that's about 1/15 of all of the money that you spend on K through 12 education.
And that's just for that's just for the 26 to 36%. That doesn't even cover the first 26% of this broken teacher retirement system. So again, it's something, I'm glad we've got the conversation started. Hopefully we can get something done in lame duck, but if we can't, we certainly need to pick it back up in January or February.
If you did nothing else but try to get your arms around the mental health issues of the state, and there's so many facets, because there's the understanding, acceptance, social end of it. Obviously, you talked about the incarceration part of it and the costs that are incurred there. This is a really big conversation to have, and it's got to be had by serious people who have an understanding of the impact, not just on the people who may be suffering, but their families and their associates. So where does that conversation start when you consider it is probably a much bigger problem than most of the people watching this morning really know?
Oh, absolutely. And one thing I would say about myself is I am a coalitions builder. One thing that I worked on when we came here was addressing our preliminary examination system in the state of Michigan. Now, unless you've been a victim of a crime, a defendant, or a defense attorney, you probably don't even know what a preliminary exam is. But what it is it's the start of the criminal justice process. And this system was costing our taxpayers, particularly our local taxpayers, millions of dollars a year. We were re-victimizing victims. And this was something that our legislature had tried for about 2 decades to fix. I came in and I said, hey, I want to address this issue. And everybody told me, Tom, you'll never get it done. Well, you know why we never got anything done? Because nobody ever took the district court judges and the prosecutors, put them in a room together and said, how do we fix this problem? We did that about 4 years ago. Those 2 groups emerged with an awesome compromise that was completely different from where I wanted to go, but I will admit was much better. Within a few days, I called the Defense Bar and the ACLU, and they said, hey, we like this proposal. Can you give us A, B, and C? I said, I can give you A. I'll meet you halfway with B, and I can't give you C. They shook my hand, and they said, let's get it done. I'm proud to say that passed 110-0 in the House, and I believe it was 36 or 37-1 in the Senate. So only one no vote between both chambers. That was about bringing groups together to solve one of our state's most pressing issues. So to go back to your question in terms of this mental health issue, how do we address it? What we do is we get all the stakeholders, we get all the interest groups, we bring them to the table, and we talk about this pressing problem and see how do we solve it as a state.
So how do you get along in a partisan environment like Lansing? We'll ask the Speaker-elect next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Tom Leonard is the Speaker-elect for the House of Representatives in Lansing, and he says one of the things he thinks he has to do is to build coalitions, bring people together to get things done. Let's talk about that coalition building, and I want to come back to the skilled trades, because that's something we've talked about a lot on the show with the governor and with others. Building coalitions. One of the things that we have heard about Lansing, and we have heard it from people like me who have said, well, you know, when you go in that chamber, it's just not the way it used to be. You don't have that long-term association. You haven't built the relationships with people. You're only here for 6 years. You're on staggered terms, and you'll have people that you as the speaker will only be associated with for 2 years because they're just now coming in. And it is logically more difficult to build those kind of relationships. So in order to build a coalition, a short period of time, how do you do that, particularly now as speaker? How do you do that to make sure that everybody has a chance to be heard at very least?
Well, first, it's about reaching out and communication. But secondly, it's about a C word that I don't hear us talk about enough, and it's not compromise. Compromise is a good word and certainly something that we need to have, but the C word we need to talk more about is civility. And in fact, I had this conversation with the incoming Minority Leader, Sam Singh. He and I met for breakfast a couple weeks ago. We had a fantastic conversation. Now, are he and I ever going to be together on every issue? Absolutely not. But what we need to make certain is that when we have our battles, we're doing so in a respectful and a civil manner so that we can, when it's over, we can come back to the table and we can see where we can work together at. If you were to look behind you right now, I've got a plaque right there behind you. And it was for a scholarship that I had received when I was in law school. It's called the Ralph M. Freeman Scholarship. Now, a lot of folks don't know what that is. I didn't know until I got it. And I wish it was, because I could tell you I was the smartest kid in the class. I wasn't. The reason I got that is because I was deemed as the one person over the course of 3 years who had most exemplified the rules of professional conduct by treating every person in that building with dignity and respect. And I asked the dean, I said, Dean, how in the heck did I get this? And he said, well, you were nominated. And he gave me an individual by the name of Joe Calhoun. Now, Joe Calhoun was a friend of mine. He was about as far left as I am right, currently works for the Peace Corps. And when I talked to him, I said, Joe, why in the world did you do this? And he said, Tom, let me tell you something about you. He said, I know you and I don't see the world from the same view. He said, but you've always been respectful. You've always treated me with dignity. And every time you disagree, your reasons are well thought out. And Rick, that's how we need to treat people. We need to make certain that we've got more civility in this process. That's the promise I have given to incoming Minority Leader Singh, and I think I will get the same thing back from him, and I think you're going to see a very productive 2 years.
Can you change the culture of Lansing in an ongoing trajectory? Because you know what it has been like over here. You haven't been here for all of those battles that we had 10 years ago, but there have been some pretty ugly times on the floor, and even in recent years, it hasn't always been pleasant.
I can't do it myself, but it starts with me. And I will make certain that this is communicated to my caucus. In fact, it already has on day one. I already talked to them about this, and as a team and working together with the Democrats, absolutely we can change the culture. Again, can I do it myself? No, I can't, but it starts with me.
Let's move on to something that we've heard a lot about in this state, and I've interviewed 9 or 10 new freshman members, and I think to a person, each of them talked about skilled trades and getting people in their individual districts trained for jobs that are open. You talked about welding just a little bit ago, but there are any number of different types of skill sets
Absolutely.
that don't require a 4-year college degree perhaps, but maybe 2-year or even a training period of time. How do you how do you accomplish that? I'm old enough. I remember we used to do that in high school.
Right.
We had masonry, we had VOAG, we had we had welding, as a matter of fact, in the school where I went. And so you would graduate from high school and maybe become an intern or get an apprenticeship, and maybe within a couple of years you were in one of those jobs that pays well and has benefits and probably sets you up for a career.
Well, again, I don't claim to have all the answers to particularly this particular problem, but what I know is an issue has been diagnosed and we need to fix it. Now, again, I'd like to bring all the coalitions together, see what they have to say. I even spoke to one of the trade union representatives just a couple days ago asking me if I'd be willing to sit down with him. I said, absolutely, because he knows this is a big issue of mine. What I would say at first blush is we really need to look at our community colleges. Let's face it, it's going to be impractical and too expensive to put a new wood shop in every single high school, to put the things that they need for welding or mechanics or what have you. So I think we could really look at our community colleges and see where could they fit in to help us fill these gaps for these young men and women that don't want a four-year degree. They want to go and receive some type of certificate for a skilled trades after they graduate.
Let's talk a little bit about that from a practical standpoint. You bring up costs, and obviously going into every high school would be very difficult. And some of the community colleges, as you point out, are already set up. But there is the question of cost and how you deal with that. And that cost extends with a particular focus on the higher education when you start looking at those four-year college degrees where the cost of tuition continues to rise. How do you control, maybe that's not the word, how do you assess that cost and then try to keep it in a manageable range? Because there are a whole lot of families out there watching this program that would love to see their kids go to college and may well see them go to college, but then they'll see them come out with $100,000 debt on the other end, which is the equivalent of buying, for some folks, having a house payment when you get done with college.
Yep. So if we had talked about 5 things that you'd like to see me accomplish or I'd like to work on going forward, that's one of the issues I certainly would have addressed, and that is how do we rein in these ever-increasing tuition costs that our young men and women, our young kids, or our parents for that matter, are paying to these universities. Certainly something we need to discuss or at least get the conversation going. Now, I've got a good friend, his name is Keith Faber. He's the Senate President in the state of Ohio. They actually tackled this issue and they have brought down or they've reined in tuition substantially. So one thing I would like to do is get a group of 3 or 4 legislators and either bring Keith here or go down with that group to Ohio and see some of the things that they've tackled or they've accomplished. Now, one of the differences I think that he has versus us is that, as you know, universities are essentially their own entity within our state constitution. I don't think they have that issue in Ohio. So it might be much different for us as we try to tackle this issue, but certainly you've identified a problem that's certainly out there. We need to fix it.
When you think about that as a fix, obviously it will not, like all things government, be overnight. So it's one of those things that occurs to me, it's kind of like the roads plan. You have to come up with a plan and then count on the goodwill of legislatures in the future to kind of go along, because that's not something you fix in 2 years or in 6 years. I mean, it's going to be somebody else's term by the time it gets fixed.
Right, and again, as our Constitution works, and as these universities are their own entity, it may be a year-by-year thing with good practices and putting strings on the appropriations that they get each year. Again, I don't claim to have all the answers in terms of how do we solve this problem, but certainly we know we've diagnosed the problem. There's nobody that we talk to that believes that tuition costs aren't a problem, and it's certainly something that we need to look at addressing.
We've already heard a little bit about your style, about trying to build coalitions and trying to teach people, treat people with respect. What's your take on being in the legislature? Because with term limits, things happen quickly. Mm-hmm. You become Speaker pro tem. You become Speaker. And it all has happened, will have happened within that 6-year window. What kind of a learning curve has that been for you?
It's fast, and you got to pick it up very quickly when you get here. And if you're not a people person, if you're not one that's willing to build coalitions, if you're one that's not willing to build relationships, I have seen this 6 years can pass you by very quickly without you getting anything anywhere near what you wanted to accomplish. So for all of the incoming legislators, and I've talked to them about this business is all about people. First and foremost, the people that we represent, the people back in our districts, but it's also about people here that we serve with and building coalitions and relationships with them. So I've told them, I've said, guys, Get back to your districts. You've got to work your districts. You've got to hold your coffee hours. You've got to listen to what is on the minds of your constituents. But don't hesitate every week or two to kick back here for one evening and go to dinner with a friend that you serve with and figure out what's on their mind. What affects folks in Detroit? What affects folks in Grand Rapids? What affects folks in Lansing? What affects folks in the UP? And that's the best way that I believe you can get things accomplished around here, is by building relationships with your colleagues.
Politics is never far away from government. That is either for the better or for the worse, and I'll let others decide that. But a new political environment is about to envelop this country with the inauguration of President-elect Trump. How does an administration, in this case it happens to be from the Republican Party, but how does the administration in Washington impact what happens here? Because Washington takes a long time to change policy. We were talking about energy earlier,
Yep.
and there may be new energy policy, but the state of Michigan likely will have an energy policy, a new energy policy before Washington does, just because of the way it works. What does Washington mean when it comes to governance in Lansing?
Well, I'm hoping that this administration is going to turn over more authority to the states. I mean, when you look at our budget right now, I believe it's a $54 billion budget, and I think at least 2/3 of that is controlled by the federal government. That is just wrong, and that's not how I believe or perceive that our founders ever intended this. They wanted 50 laboratories of experimentation. So I am hoping that this Trump administration, and what I'm hearing is good at this point, that they turn over some of the reins or some of that money back over to the states. Now, the jury's still out. We'll see what happens. I know a lot of folks are sitting back wondering what's going to happen, but that's my hope, is that this administration will empower these 50 laboratories of experimentation.
All right, in the couple of minutes we have left, we know we're right in the middle of a lame duck session. Now, by the time this airs, 2 or 3 more session days will have passed, and things could have changed a little bit. So with that stipulation, let's talk about that. We already talked a little bit about the retirement system. You say you would like to get to it, but it is also a heavy lift.
Absolutely.
Although you accurately point out, sometimes in lame duck, it's kind of like that night before Christmas. Sometimes things do kind of magically happen. But if we put that aside for a moment, the other big issue is energy. And that's what I was alluding to a moment ago, that energy policy could be changed based on what happens in Washington. But there are a lot of people in Lansing and a lot of stakeholders who hope that Michigan's energy policy gets set regardless of and before any of those. So moving forward over the next few days and into next week, which likely be the final week of lame duck, how likely is it that energy gets done?
You know, right now, and this is just me predicting, I would say it's 50-50, because I know there's a lot of focus on it right now. However, I know as we sit here on this particular day, the two sides are worlds apart. That's not to say they can't come together. For me, I would love to see us get this accomplished in lame duck, but it's got to be good, sound policy and something that's good for our ratepayers. I personally cannot get behind anything that I perceive is going to be bad policy, as much as I'd like to get it done this term, or during lame duck, but I'm not going to pigeonhole myself to where I'm voting for bad policy just to get it off the table. If we can't get what I believe is the right policy done, I'm willing to go into next year if that's what it takes.
Is the biggest holdup choice, or the perception of choice?
I think there's a couple things that are out there on the horizon right now. Choice is a big one. There's this debate as to whether or not the 10% that's there, is it true choice or not. Many of us, like myself, would like to see some true choice, but also the renewable standards. Those have been increased in the Senate bill from 10 to 15%. That gives me serious heartburn, particularly in a district like mine where wind turbines is a big issue. And a lot of my citizens don't want to see these things put up in their backyard anymore. They've had enough of those. But also for me personally, I'm also looking out to see where Dow Chemical is going to shape up on this issue. They are not located in my district, they're in Rep. Glenn's district, but they employ hundreds of people in or near my district. So that's something that's very important to me as well.
We're back with more To the Point. And the Speaker of the House is not the only new member of leadership. The Democrats have a new minority leader as well. Next week here on the program, we'll introduce you to Representative Sam Singh when you join us Sunday morning, 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.